Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for December the 11th, 2021. Hope you're doing well. So our text we have for today are 2 Chronicles 11 and 12. Then we have Revelation 2, starting the letters to the churches, the 7 churches in Revelation. We'll be there today and tomorrow. And then we'll have, we've got Zephaniah 3, as I previewed yesterday. This is one of my favorite texts in all the Bible. And then finally, John 1, one of the most important texts in all the Bible for understanding Jesus. So a lot of rich stuff. So let's dive right on in. We'll start with 2 Chronicles. A couple of things about 2 Chronicles here. Notice that where we are. So we've been through 1 Chronicles, and that went through 1 through 29. And now we've got 2 Chronicles, and we're in, the 2 Chronicle goes through 36. I want to make sure I'm telling you right. It goes through 36. So we're a third of the way through 2 Chronicles here. And we're finally getting to the fourth king in the history of Israel. So we had Saul, David, Solomon, and now Rehoboam. Rehoboam and of course Jeroboam. We've seen the split between the north and the south. We saw that yesterday. So it's at that point where we now have the rest of the history of Israel. So that's 931, and Chronicles ends in 539. So 931 to 539, we that's what I'm not going to even try to. That's almost 400 years, right? Yeah, it's almost 400 years. 400 years being dealt with, and just a 2/3 of this book, whereas the first third of the book and the whole book of First Chronicles dealt with, 100 years of Saul, David, and Solomon. It shows you what the emphasis of the author is. The author has his eyes drawn to David and Solomon, and there's a reason, and that is once again, because David and Solomon represent what is the hope of Israel, the king in the line of David. Now, a couple of things that we find here, we kind of have some details on Rehoboam's reign. So remember, he's in the south, Jeroboam's in the north. Jeroboam, of course, was not a lot of attention paid to the northern kingdom as a whole in the book of Chronicles, because it's mostly focused on the south, unlike in Kings, where you get a lot of emphasis on what's going on in the north as well as the south. And there's again a reason for that, because the author is writing to mainly Jewish people, people from Judah. But also, one of the things that we see here in this kind of survey of Rehoboam's reign is we get a hint at some of the emphases of the author once again. One of the things that I thought was interesting, the passage starting in chapter 11, verse 14, where it says the Levites left their pasture land. Let's start with verse 13. Moreover, the priests and the Levites who were in all Israel, there's that phrase again, all Israel stood with him from all their districts, and the Levites left their pasture lands and their property, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem. For Jeroboam, and here's the reason, so this is from all over the kingdom, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, all the Levites. Remember, the Levites were kind of stationed in different Levitical cities throughout the nation. And so they're now coming back to Jerusalem. Why? It's because Jeroboam had excluded them from serving as priests to the Lord. And he set up his own priests and his own high places and calves which he had made. So he's doing all this state-sponsored idolatry in the north. And these priests who are wanting to remain loyal to Yahweh are coming back to the south. And I think that's a kind of a subtle message to those who are in the chronicler's day and age. Those who are faithful, who want to serve the Lord, come back to Jerusalem, come back to this place to worship properly before the Lord. Then we have some hints. So remember, David and Solomon are somewhat whitewashed by the author of Chronicles. Not so much with Rehoboam. Rehoboam starts, the kings that we'll see from this point onward, we'll see with all their faults. So whereas David and Solomon are presented in this ideal way, Rehoboam and everyone subsequent to Rehoboam will not be. So the kingdom that Rehoboam established was strong, and he and all Israel, verse 12 or verse 1 of chapter 12, forsook the law of the Lord. And what happens? They're invaded by this Egyptian king Shishak, who comes in and plunders the temple, and it just starts the ball rolling down towards exile. And it's going to be the reason why the kings are disobedient is going to become evident as we see more and more stories. And so I'm going to save that for later, but I think you'll see a recurring theme of the character trait of the kings that lead Israel astray, that lead the southern kingdom astray, Judah. So that's 2 Chronicles 11 and 12. Let's move over to Revelation 2. So in Revelation 2, we're starting with these letters to the churches in Revelation. And remember, there's 7 of these. And there are, make sure I'm still recording. I had to check for a minute there. So a couple of things about these letters. First thing is that some people have gotten really creative with these to say, well, the letters represent these different churches represent different ages within the church. And so there's the Ephesian age and there's the Laodicean age and all these different things. That's getting a little bit too crazy with it. These are practical letters. These are real letters. And if you look at Ephesus, a map, all these Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, all these are cities in Asia Minor, and they roughly are in order of the way in which the mail route would go. So Ephesus on the very coast of Asia Minor, and then you kind of go in this circle to where you get to the final letter, which goes to Laodicea. So these letters are very much practically oriented, encouraging and exhorting perseverance, perseverance against false teaching as well, perseverance in the midst of persecution. So these are exhortative materials. They're exhortative letters. And the way in which they're posed, every one of the letters, and I think I've mentioned this before, but every one of the letters will use are coming from Jesus. And he identifies himself in each one with some character trait that was introduced in chapter 1 from that original vision. So for instance, in the church to Ephesus is the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. That's from chapter 1. In verse 8, the first and the last who was dead and who has come to life. That's also from chapter 1. The one who has a sharp 2-edged sword in verse 12 of chapter 2. And each of those character traits has a significance for whatever the letter is addressing. Let's see, what else can we say about these letters? They are prophetic in this sense. Remember, prophecy in the Old Testament context is exhortation in order to change mindsets and behaviors of God's people so that they are walking in more closely in covenant relationship with God. It's bringing them back into covenant relationship, exhortation in that sense. That's exactly what these letters are, what Jesus's words are. When it says the one who whatever says this, thus says this person, that's the prophetic formula from the Old Testament, thus says the Lord. So these are urgings, exhortations for covenant obedience. And that's what you'll see through all of these. Now, each of these churches are addressing different things. Some of the churches are getting commendations and no criticisms from Jesus. The church at Smyrna, the church at Philadelphia. There are churches that only get criticism and no condemnations. That's the church at Laodicea. And then most of them, the rest of them, 4 of them, Ephesus, Pergamum, Thyatira, and Sardis, they're all getting some commendations and some condemnations. And again, the purposes of studying these churches is a very practical message, but it's a practical message not just for them, it's for us as well. Keep in mind that these were probably meant to circulate, these letters. and of course they're included in this book of Revelation, which is for all as well. But even the words that Jesus uses here, what does he say with each of these? He says, let him who has ears to hear, let him hear what he is saying to the churches, not just to the church, right? So this is a message for us today. Even the number 7, I think, is symbolic, right? The number of perfection, of completeness. This is a message for all of us. So what are some of those messages? Again, wake up, remembering your first love, keep his word, and perseverance. All these different things you'll find through these letters. And we could spend a lot of time on them, obviously, because I think I did an entire sermon series on these letters at one point. So, but we don't have time for that. But I just wanted to give you an overview of what you're going to find in these letters. All right, let's move on then to what's our next one. So we did Revelation 2. We haven't done John yet. So, and we did Chronicles. So let's do John 1 while we're here, and then we'll go over to Zephaniah. So John 1, of course, this I've mentioned this before, but in the New Testament, you have some great Christological passages that speak of the divinity of Jesus. And those, of course, are Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, and Philippians 2, and John 1. What we find in John 1 is the famous Prologue of John. This goes from John 1 through verse 1 through verse 18. And this is where John speaks of Jesus as the Word, speaking of Jesus as the very revelation of God. He became flesh and he dwelt among us, but he revealed who God is, right? He look at verse 18, that he has explained God. But not only does he reveal God, he is God. This word was in the beginning and was in the beginning with God, and he was God. So this is speaking of that divinity of Jesus, and he was there at creation. That even that phrase, "in the beginning was the Word," should ring a bell, right? Because it goes back to Genesis 1. Same phrase, kind of phraseology. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word. And all things came into being, verse 3, through him. This character trait of God as the creator, Jesus is taking on that character trait. He's the one who brought about creation. And this, of course, is speaking once again to deity, because for a Jew, only God is the one who creates. Only God, I think I mentioned this before, but in the Old Testament, that phrase, that verb, create, bara, in the Hebrew, only God is ever the subject of that verb. But here, Jesus is the one who is bringing about creation. So Jesus is that revelation of God, and he is the one who reveals who he is. And also, we pointed this out before, that he is full of grace and truth. This is straight from Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that self-revelation of God in the book of Exodus, we pointed to many times, that God is a God who is full of grace and truth. Well, here's Jesus, full of grace and truth. So everything that we find in John 1, in this first part in the prologue, shows Jesus as this as the Son of God, as the divine Son in the Godhead, in the Trinity. So beautiful little text. And then, of course, that's not the only thing that we find in John 1. We see Jesus beginning his ministry here, and we have the testimony of John the Baptist as well. Notice that this doesn't begin with unlike with Matthew and Luke, it doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus. It begins directly with his ministry. And John is kind of like that as well. Remember that John is more of a theological book. It's not going to, it's very selective. John even tells us that, right? In John 20:31, he tells us what his purpose is, that these things he's written, Jesus did a whole bunch of stuff, but he's written these things that we may know that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and believing in him, have life in his name. So it's meant to encourage belief. That's why, by the way, John, the Gospel of John, is a great book to look at if you're going to be sharing the gospel with somebody. It's a great book because it's selected events for that purpose, to show who Jesus is and to encourage belief in him. And so what we're going to find here is that we don't have a lot of teaching on the kingdom of God. We don't have a lot of the parables, and we have miracles, but not all the miracles that we find in the Synoptic Gospels. It goes at a different pace and at a different, it hits on different things in the Gospel of John than we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's a reason for that, and that is that John is rapidly getting to the teachings of Jesus on himself that he'll do in the upper room in John 13 through 17. And then, of course, the time of Jesus's resurrection and crucifixion. And so it's almost as if John is saying, all of this, if you want to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and have life in his name, you look to the last week of his life. And so half the book of John is dealing with that last week of Jesus's life. So it very rapidly gets to that last week. So we start out with this grand and glorious picture of who Jesus is in the prologue as the divine Son of God, and then we get to what that divine Son of God did on our behalf, his suffering and death, and ultimately his resurrection for our life at the end of the book of John. So that's John 1. Let's move on finally to Zephaniah, and put my marker here so I won't lose my place. So in Zephaniah 3, so we've looked at this book of Zephaniah prophesying in this coming day of the Lord, probably the exile, and we talked about just how brutal this day of the Lord. It's not just a day of the Lord that's going to be for Judah, it's for the all these nations are going to be experiencing the wrath of God. It's a dark day. It's a day of judgment. It's a day that is universal in its judgment, and the whole world will be experiencing in this judgment. And yet, as dark as that day is, it's also looking forward to a brighter day of God's restoration. And what I love about the prophets, and I've mentioned this before, is that the prophets, the brightness of, we often think about the prophets as just being kind of dark and got all these judgments and things like that. And rightly so, there are those things that we find there. And if you understand what Israel was doing at the time, you understand why they were being judged in that way. But at the same time, the darkness is placed in contrast with the brightness. You find these wonderful texts of restoration. And that those texts of restoration become all the more brighter when you place them in contrast to the darkness that we find in some of the prophecies of judgment. So I'll try to do this. I'm going to take my ring off. So it's kind of dull. I need to get it polished. But here's my wedding ring, and I've got this this dark felt here. But that it doesn't look that bright. But when you put this wedding ring against the darkness of this black felt, it becomes much more brighter, right? And the same thing is working with these prophecies. So you have this prophecy that we find in Zephaniah 3 that's just a beautiful text, but it's all the more beautiful when we consider it in light of what we just read in chapters 1 and 2. The darkness of that day of the Lord of judgment is being contrasted with the brightness of the day of the Lord of restoration. So what kind of things do we see in this day of the Lord of restoration? We'll look at, let's see, what can we say? Well, one of the things that you will see is that you'll see that just as there was a universal judgment, that the judgment against Judah is not just for Judah, but it's for the entire world. There's going to be a universal restoration as well. That it's all the kingdoms who will benefit from this. It's all the nations that will be gathered. And he will give people purified lips, verse 9. And all of them will call upon the name of the Lord and stand shoulder to shoulders. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, my dispersed ones will bring offerings. So I love the image of purified lips. It's almost as there's this reversal of Babel going on there. In that day, you will feel no shame. It's a reversal of the fall, the Garden of Eden, right? When Adam and Eve are confronted, they feel shame, right? Because they're naked and now they're ashamed. Here's that it's being reversed. A reversal of the cause of the judgment. You will never again be haughty, verse 11, on my holy mountain. And so you have this beautiful picture of a reversal of all the judgments, of all the covenant curses that have come upon Israel. God will reverse them, and he will bring them and will bring all nations back to Zion to worship him rightly. But then what will he do once he gets all his people back to him? The Lord will be in his midst. Verse 17, a victorious warrior, and he will exult over you with joy. He will quiet you in his love, and he will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. What a beautiful picture that is of God rejoicing, singing over his people with shouts of joy. One of my favorite scholars, O. Palmer Robertson, I've referred to him before. By the way, if you ever want a good book to read on the prophets, you will not find a better one. In fact, I use it in my prophets class that I'm actually teaching next semester, called The Christ of the Prophets from O. Palmer Robertson. But he calls this text here to John 3:16 of the Old Testament. And I think that's a pretty good portrayal of it, right? Because it's talking about how God is going to bring his people back and rejoice over them, save them as this victorious warrior who is in their midst. And we just read about John 1 when this would happen, right? That God, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's when the restoration would happen. And through that restoration, God will bring to himself a people that he will rejoice over. Yes, his people were rejoicing, but God himself will be rejoicing with shouts of joy. It's almost like, for instance, the celebration would happen in a marriage type of celebration. And that's exactly what this is, a reunion between a spouse who had been adulterous being brought back, and God restoring them to proper covenant relationship, and God rejoicing over them. What a reversal from what we saw in chapters 1 and 2. I think that's it for today. We did Zephaniah 3, we did John 1, Revelation 2, and then 2 Chronicles 11 and 12. So hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, December 11th, 2021.